The emergency alarm sliced through the operations center like a blade through butter. In that split second when everyone froze, hearts suspended, breath caught, a voice crackled through the emergency channel, distorted by static and desperation, calling out a military call sign that had been buried in classified archives for nearly a decade. "Do you copy?" Stood near the back wall, clipboard in hand, his presence so unremarkable that most people in the room had long forgotten he existed. But when that call sign echoed through the speakers, something fundamental shifted inside him. His spine straightened like a steel rod being magnetized. His eyes locked onto the central display with laser focus. And without hesitation, without permission, without a single breath of doubt, he answered. "Copies." CEO of Meridian Aerospace, architect of a $200 million empire, whipped around from her position at the command table. Her eyes found the source of that voice, and for the first time in 18 months, she actually saw. Not as background noise, not as a forgettable logistics coordinator, but as something else entirely. Something she should have noticed long ago. She'd walked past this man 100 times. She'd never once truly looked. Lived his life in 15-minute increments, each block of time carved out with surgical precision. Every morning began at 5:45, not because an alarm demanded it, but because his body had learned years ago that discipline was the only reliable foundation for survival. He'd rise in the cramped 2-bedroom apartment he rented on the east side, moving with practiced silence so as not to wake his daughter sleeping in the room next door. By 6:15, he'd completed a workout that required no equipment, just body weight, repetition, and the kind of focus that transformed physical exertion into meditation. Push-ups until his muscles screamed, planks until time dissolved, squats until his legs trembled with the memory of carrying weight that wasn't just physical. By 6:45, breakfast sat on the table. Eggs, toast, orange juice. The same meal every single day, because predictability was a gift he could give his daughter even when he couldn't give her much else. Lily was 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn silence. She'd learned early that wasn't a man who explained himself, but she'd also learned something more important. He never failed to show up. Every school pickup, every parent-teacher conference, every nightmare that jolted her awake at 2 a.m. was there. He'd arranged his entire existence around that single, unbreakable promise. His job at Meridian Aerospace had been deliberately chosen for its invisibility. Ground operations support, a position that required competence but demanded zero ambition. He monitored logistics, coordinated maintenance schedules, filed reports that vanished into digital oblivion. His supervisors considered him reliable and utterly forgettable. Exactly what he wanted. He clocked in at 8:00, clocked out at 4:30, never once volunteered for overtime. His colleagues assumed he lacked drive. They couldn't have been more wrong. Operated in a different universe entirely. At 38, she'd clawed her way to the top of Meridian Aerospace through relentless intelligence and an almost surgical ability to identify weakness. She trusted data over intuition, hierarchy over instinct, and she'd built a company culture that mirrored those values with ruthless efficiency. Her days began with briefings and ended with strategy sessions. Somewhere in between, she made decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever pausing to consider the individual weight of each one. She wasn't cruel, just efficient. And efficiency, she'd learned, required a certain blindness to the personal. The first time truly noticed was during a routine inspection of the operations floor. A shipment had been delayed, and she descended personally to demand answers, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel through flesh. When she found the logistics coordinator responsible, she issued rapid-fire instructions designed to minimize damage. Stood nearby, ostensibly organizing equipment manifests, but noticed he'd quietly rerouted 2 secondary shipments to cover the gap before she'd even finished speaking. He didn't announce what he'd done, didn't seek credit, just solved the problem and returned to his clipboard as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. For a moment, felt something she rarely experienced, curiosity. But then her phone rang. The moment passed and faded back into the background where he seemed determined to remain. 3 weeks later, the pressure began building like a storm front nobody could see coming. Meridian Aerospace was in the final stages of launching a new autonomous flight navigation system, a project representing 18 months of development and $200 million in investment. Had staked her reputation on this launch. She'd assembled her best people in the operations center to oversee final integration tests. Wasn't among them. He wasn't invited to briefings, wasn't consulted on decisions. He was simply present, as always, performing his routine tasks with the same quiet efficiency that rendered him invisible to everyone who mattered. But saw things others missed. He'd spent too many years reading instruments and scanning horizons to ignore the subtle warnings most people dismissed as noise. The navigation system's calibration data showed a drift pattern. The engineers attributed it to normal variance, acceptable, expected, nothing to worry about, recognized it as something else. He'd seen the same pattern once before in a different cockpit under very different circumstances. That drift had cost lives. He approached the lead engineer during a brief lull in the testing sequence, choosing his words carefully, keeping his tone neutral. He explained what he'd observed, suggested the calibration protocol be repeated with parameters. The engineer barely looked up from his tablet. "Numbers are within acceptable range," he said, dismissive as a door closing. "Systems performing exactly as designed." He thanked for his input and waved him away like an irritating fly. Returned to his station, but something tightened in his chest, a knot of knowledge and helplessness. He knew he was right. He also knew that being right meant nothing if nobody would listen. His phone buzzed. A text from the after-school program. "Lily has a fever. Can someone pick her up early?" Stared at the message for a long, agonizing moment. In the past, he would left immediately. His daughter came first. Always. But today, something held him in place. The drift pattern on the display, the engineer's dismissive wave, the memory of what happened the last time he'd trusted someone else to catch a mistake he'd already seen. He silenced his phone and turned back to the monitors. For the first time in years, he chose to stay. That choice, small as it seemed, would detonate everything that followed. Noticed the change before she understood it. During the afternoon briefing, her attention kept drifting from slide presentations and status updates to the far corner where stood with his ever-present clipboard. He was watching the main display with an intensity that seemed wildly disproportionate to his role. When the lead engineer announced final calibration was complete and all systems nominal, his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but there. When the operations director declared the launch window confirmed, his eyes moved to a secondary monitor nobody else was watching. Made a mental note and continued with the meeting, but something nagged at her, an itch she couldn't scratch. After the briefing concluded, she lingered near the coffee station where was refilling his cup. She approached casually, as if the encounter were accidental, and asked what he thought of the presentation. Looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable as a locked vault. "I think the team was very thorough," he said. Then he returned to his station without another word. It was the most carefully neutral statement had ever heard. It told her absolutely nothing, except that was hiding something significant. She began paying closer attention. She noticed the way he anticipated problems before they appeared on monitors. The way his eyes tracked multiple systems simultaneously with the kind of situational awareness that seemed impossible to develop behind a desk. She noticed the precision of his movements, the economy of his words, the subtle tension that never quite left his shoulders. Most of all, she noticed the clock. Every day, without fail, began preparing to leave at exactly 4:15. Not 4:30 when his shift ended, but 4:15, as if those final 15 minutes required careful negotiation with some invisible obligation. On this particular day, positioned herself near the exit at 4:20. When approached, she stopped him with a question about a supply requisition that could easily have waited until morning. He answered politely, professionally, but she saw his eyes flick to the wall clock. She asked a follow-up question. His answers remained patient, but something in his posture shifted, became imperceptibly more urgent. She let him go at 4:28. He walked out at a pace just slightly faster than usual. That night, sitting in her corner office with city lights spread beneath her like a glowing circuit board, pulled up's personnel file. The basic information was unremarkable. Age 36, single father, one dependent, hired 18 months ago as a logistics coordinator. Performance reviews consistently rated him as meets expectations, the most damning praise in corporate vocabulary. But there was something else, a notation she hadn't noticed before. A 6-year gap between his previous employment and his current position. 6 years during which had apparently done nothing, earned nothing, existed nowhere. That gap didn't suggest unemployment. It suggested erasure, the kind that required significant resources and even more significant reasons. His curiosity evolved into something closer to obsession. She made discreet inquiries through channels most CEOs didn't know existed, leveraging contacts from her previous career in defense contracting. Initial responses were discouraging. His background check had been thorough and unremarkable. References, credentials exactly what they appeared to be. But had learned long ago that the most interesting information lived in the spaces between official records. She asked more specific questions, mentioned the 6-year gap, suggested situational awareness seemed inconsistent with his stated work history. The responses changed. Her contacts became evasive, which told her more than any direct answer could have. Someone had taken considerable effort to bury his past. That effort had been largely successful, but had one advantage most investigators lacked. She'd been watching for weeks, cataloging his behaviors, noting small details others dismissed as unremarkable. One detail kept returning, the way he'd reacted to an emergency alarm during a drill 2 weeks earlier. Not panic, not even the controlled concern of trained first responders. Something older, deeper. The instantaneous calm of someone who'd faced genuine emergencies so many times that artificial ones barely registered. Knew he was being watched. He'd spent too many years in environments where surveillance was constant to miss the signs. Questions had been casual, but her attention was anything but. He understood his carefully constructed anonymity was beginning to unravel. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. In his apartment that evening, after Lily was asleep, he sat in darkness and held a small metal object. A challenge coin, worn smooth by years of handling, bearing an insignia that no longer officially existed. The coin had been presented to him on the worst day of his life, a commemoration of a mission that had succeeded tactically and failed in every way that mattered. He'd kept it not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every decision had consequences. Every choice carried weight. Some mistakes could never be undone, only survived. His daughter's voice called out from her bedroom, remnant of a bad dream. Slipped the coin into his pocket as he went to comfort her. Whatever discovered about his past, it wouldn't change who he was now. He was a father, a man who showed up. Tomorrow, like every day before, he'd clock in at 8:00 and clock out at 4:30, and he'd be there when Lily got home from school. The rest was history, and history, he'd learned, was only as powerful as you allowed it to be. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. The crisis that had been building beneath the surface of Meridian Aerospace's operations finally erupted on a Tuesday morning in late March. The autonomous navigation system had championed was undergoing its final pre-launch test when the first anomaly appeared, a minor deviation in flight path calculation, easily corrected by backup systems. Engineers noted it, logged it, continued with the sequence. 10 minutes later, a second anomaly appeared. Larger this time. Backup systems engaged, but their corrections created a cascading effect the primary system hadn't been programmed to anticipate. Within 20 minutes, the test aircraft was flying a course that bore little resemblance to its intended trajectory. The operations center had shifted from routine monitoring to active crisis management. Stood at the command table, surrounded by senior engineers, watching the main display with an expression that betrayed nothing of the fear building in her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. The system had been tested thousands of times, every variable accounted for, every contingency planned. But the aircraft was now 3 miles off course with no signs of self-correction. If it continued on its current trajectory, it would enter restricted airspace within the hour. The lead engineer suggested aborting the test, triggering the emergency return protocol that would bring the aircraft back to its launch point. Agreed, the command was issued. Nothing happened. The aircraft continued on its errant course, deaf to signals being transmitted from the ground. The operations center fell silent, understood with terrible clarity that they were watching a disaster unfold in real time. And then a voice crackled through the emergency channel, a voice nobody expected, speaking words nobody understood. "This is Sierra Base. We have a runaway asset approaching your sector. Do you copy?" The transmission wasn't meant for them, wasn't meant for anyone in that room. It was bleeding through from a military frequency that should have been completely separate from their civilian systems. But before anyone could question how it was happening, another voice answered. "Copies, Sierra Base." Stood near the secondary monitoring station, his hand on a communications panel he shouldn't have known how to operate. His voice was calm, authoritative, completely unlike the quiet logistics coordinator they'd all ignored for 18 months. He was speaking a language of call signs and coordinates and threat assessments that transformed chaos into something manageable, something that could be addressed systematically. Watched as took control, not through rank or position, but through sheer competence. He identified the source of the system failure, the same calibration drift he'd warned about weeks earlier. He calculated an interception trajectory that would guide the aircraft away from restricted airspace. He coordinated with the military channel that had inadvertently connected to their systems, explaining the situation in terms they understood, requesting permission for a corrective maneuver that would require temporarily overriding civilian air traffic protocols. Through it all, he never raised his voice, never showed fear, never hesitated. He simply did what needed to be done. Within 45 minutes, the crisis was contained. Aircraft safely redirected, restricted airspace never breached. The only casualty was the certainty had carried into that morning, the belief that she understood the people who worked for her. Released the communications panel and stepped back from the station. He looked at the wall clock. 4:23. He was going to be late picking up his daughter. That, more than anything that had just happened, seemed to weigh on him. The aftermath unfolded in layers, each one revealing something hadn't previously understood. In the immediate hours following the incident, she focused on damage control. The launch would be delayed. The navigation system would require comprehensive review. Investors would need reassurance. These were problems she knew how to solve, challenges that fit within her understanding of how the world worked. Didn't fit within that understanding. She found him in the after the operations center had cleared, sitting alone at a table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. When she sat down across from him, he didn't seem surprised. Asked him directly, who was he? What had he been before Meridian? Why had he been hiding something so significant from the company that employed him? Was silent for a long moment. Then he told her. He'd been a pilot. Tactical Air Command, specialized in crisis response and high-value asset recovery. He'd been good at it, perhaps too good. He'd been given missions that pushed boundaries of what was legal, what was ethical, what was survivable. On one of those missions, something had gone wrong. Not through any fault of his own, but wrong nonetheless. People had died. A cover-up had been necessary. When the dust settled, the man he'd been was deemed too much of a liability to exist. So they'd erased him. New identity, new history, new life. He'd accepted the erasure because it came with the only thing he wanted, a clean start, a chance to be a father without the shadow of his past hanging over his daughter. For 6 years, he'd lived quietly, invisibly, asking nothing from the world except the opportunity to raise his child in peace. Meridian Aerospace had been a job, nothing more. Sat with his words, trying to reconcile the man she dismissed as ordinary with the pilot who just saved her company from catastrophe. She asked why he'd stepped forward during the crisis, when he'd worked so hard to remain invisible. Looked at her, and for the first time she saw something vulnerable in his expression. He said he'd tried to warn them about the calibration drift. He'd followed proper channels. He'd trusted that someone would listen. But nobody had. When the crisis came, he'd faced a choice: protect his anonymity or prevent a disaster that could have cost lives. The choice hadn't been difficult. It had simply been painful. In the days that followed, the operations center returned to something resembling normalcy, but couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. She found herself reviewing incident logs, communications records, the moment-by-moment breakdown of how had turned chaos into order. What struck her most wasn't his technical skill, though that had been extraordinary. It was the way he'd prioritized human factors over procedural ones, making decisions official protocols would never have sanctioned, but that had undeniably been correct. She began questioning her own leadership. The engineers who dismissed warnings had done so because the culture she'd created valued hierarchy over insight. The systems that had failed had done so because she'd prioritized efficiency over redundancy. The crisis had been averted not because of her management, but despite it. That realization was uncomfortable, and had never been someone who avoided discomfort. She scheduled a private meeting with, ostensibly to discuss technical details of the incident, but really to understand something the reports couldn't tell her. They met in a conference room after hours, when the building was quiet and the pretense of corporate formality seemed unnecessary. Arrived exactly on time, his posture neither defensive nor aggressive, simply present. Asked what he would have done differently if he'd been in charge. Considered the question carefully before answering. He said he would have listened more, not to data, which could be interpreted however the interpreter preferred, but to people closest to the systems. Workers who noticed when something felt wrong. Junior analysts who lacked confidence to challenge their superiors. Invisible employees whose observations never made it into official reports. In his experience, the most important information was usually held by people with the least power to act on it. Recognized the criticism embedded in his observation. She didn't argue with it. Instead, she asked what he wanted. Not what he expected, not what he'd settle for, but what he actually wanted from this situation now that his cover had been blown. Was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he wanted what he'd always wanted, to pick up his daughter on time, to be present for moments that mattered, to live a life where his past didn't determine his future. He didn't want recognition, didn't want promotion. He simply wanted to continue existing in the margins, doing work that allowed him to be the father his daughter deserved. It was the most honest answer had ever received. It left her with nothing to say. But wanting to remain invisible and being allowed to remain invisible were two different things. Word of his intervention had spread through the company, evolving with each retelling into something resembling legend. The mysterious logistics coordinator who'd saved the day. The quiet man who spoke military codes. The father who'd walked out of the building at 4:30 as if nothing had happened, only to be seen at his daughter's school pick up 15 minutes later with a calm that bordered on supernatural. Understood she couldn't leave this story unaddressed. The board would ask questions. Investors would demand explanations. The media, if they caught wind of the incident, would dig until they found truth. And the truth, she knew, would destroy everything it built. She requested another meeting, this time in her office with the city lights as witness and the door firmly closed. She told him she needed to make a decision about how to handle his situation, and she wanted him to understand the options before she chose. Option 1, full disclosure. His identity would be revealed, his past acknowledged, his contributions celebrated. He'd become a public figure, a symbol of Meridian's resilience and resourcefulness. The company would benefit from the story. His career would be transformed. His anonymity would be permanently destroyed. Option 2, controlled suppression. The incident would be attributed to classified military cooperation that couldn't be publicly discussed. His name would never appear in any report. His contribution would be acknowledged internally, but never externally. He'd return to his logistics position as if nothing had happened, and anyone who asked questions would be directed to a carefully constructed official narrative. Listened to both options without interrupting. When finished, he asked which she preferred. Admitted that from a pure business perspective, option 1 was clearly superior. The story would generate positive publicity money couldn't buy. It would demonstrate hidden value in their workforce. It would position Meridian as a company that cultivated talent rather than simply exploiting it. But she also admitted she was no longer certain that business perspective was the only one that mattered. Thanked her for her honesty. Then he told her he couldn't make this decision alone. He had someone else to consider. He went home that evening and sat with Lily at the kitchen table, watching her work through math homework with the same stubborn concentration he recognized from his own reflection. She was growing up faster than he'd anticipated, becoming a person with her own opinions and observations and questions about the world. He'd always known this day would come, the day when his past would demand to be acknowledged. He'd simply hoped it would come later. After homework was finished and dinner dishes cleared, he sat beside her on the couch and told her something had happened at work, something that might change things for them. He explained it as simply as he could, leaving out classified details but conveying the essence. He'd helped solve a problem. People were grateful. Now some of those people wanted to tell the world about what he'd done. The question was whether he wanted the world to know. Lily thought about this for a while. Then she asked if being known would make him happy. Admitted he wasn't sure. He'd spent so many years trying not to be known that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Lily nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then she said she thought being seen was probably scary, but hiding was probably lonely. And maybe the scary thing was better than the lonely thing, as long as you had someone to be scared with. Looked at his daughter, this small person who understood more than she should have needed to understand. He felt something shift in his chest, not the resolution of his dilemma, but the beginning of clarity. He'd spent 6 years building a life designed to protect her from his past, but perhaps what she actually needed wasn't protection. Perhaps what she needed was the truth, and a father brave enough to face it. The following week, called a meeting of the senior leadership team to discuss the incident and its aftermath. She'd made her decision, and she wanted the people who'd be implementing it to understand the reasoning behind it. She explained the company would pursue neither full disclosure nor complete suppression. Instead, they'd create something new, a position that hadn't existed before, designed specifically for someone whose value couldn't be captured by traditional organizational charts. Would become a special advisor, reporting directly to her, with responsibilities that couldn't be summarized in a job description because they'd evolve based on what the company needed at any given moment. His background would be acknowledged internally as relevant to his expertise, but specific details would remain classified at his request. Externally, he'd be described simply as a crisis consultant with specialized experience, a designation vague enough to be true without being revealing. Board members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how things were typically done. Acknowledged their discomfort, then explained the incident had revealed systematic failures in how the company valued and utilized its human resources. They'd nearly lost a $200 million project because people with the most relevant expertise had been excluded from the decision-making process. That failure wasn't his responsibility to fix. It was hers, and this new position was part of how she intended to fix it. She also announced several additional changes, new protocols for escalating concerns directly to executive leadership, new metrics for evaluating performance that included input from lower-level employees, new requirements that every major project briefing include at least one participant from outside the core team, someone whose job was to notice what the insiders might have missed. The changes were modest by revolutionary standards, but understood revolutions rarely succeeded in corporate environments. What succeeded was persistent incremental pressure, applied in the right places over time. She was playing a long game. This crisis had given her the leverage to begin. After the meeting concluded, she found waiting outside her office. He'd been offered the position formally that morning, and she wanted to know his decision. He told her he had one condition: his hours couldn't change. He'd continue to leave at 4:30 without exception, without negotiation, without apology. His daughter came first. That wasn't flexible. Agreed without hesitation. She'd learned painfully that the most valuable people were often the ones with lives that mattered more to them than work. Trying to change that wasn't just ineffective, it was foolish. Accepted the position. Then he checked his watch, nodded once, and walked toward the elevator. It was 4:28. Months passed. The navigation system was relaunched successfully after comprehensive, and the incident that had nearly destroyed the project became a case study in crisis management that shared at industry conferences across the country. She never mentioned by name, but those who listened carefully could hear his influence in every lesson she drew. Settled into his new role with the same quiet competence he'd brought to every other aspect of his life. He attended briefings when his presence was valuable. He raised concerns when he saw patterns others missed. He refused to play political games, which paradoxically made him more effective than anyone who did. Executives learned to respect his judgment because it was never clouded by personal ambition. Engineers learned to seek his input because he'd tell them the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable. And Lily learned her father's job had changed, though she wasn't entirely sure how. She knew he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by invisible weights, more willing to talk about his day when she asked. He hadn't told her everything about his past, but he'd told her enough. He'd been a pilot. He'd done important work. Some of that work had been difficult, and some of it had hurt him. But now, he was finding ways to use what he'd learned without letting it define him. That, he explained, was what healing looked like. Not forgetting, not pretending, just finding new purposes for old pain. The final resolution came on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, nearly a year after the crisis that had changed everything. And Lily were at a community park, watching a youth soccer game neither of them had any stake in. simply enjoying the sunshine and the sound of children playing. Appeared beside them, dressed in casual clothes had never seen her wear, looking like a different person entirely without the armor of corporate authority. She'd come to thank him, she explained. Not for what he'd done during the crisis, which had already been acknowledged in countless ways, but for what he'd done after, for accepting the position, for staying, for showing her that leadership wasn't about knowing all the answers, but about creating space for the people who did. Accepted her thanks with the same understated grace that characterized everything he did. Then he invited her to sit and watch the game with them, an offer that surprised her more than any business negotiation ever had. They sat together as afternoon light softened. Three people whose paths had crossed through crisis and emerged into something resembling friendship. Lily eventually wandered off to join some children she recognized from school. Watched her go with the expression of a father who understood his job was to prepare her for a world he couldn't control. Asked if he missed the life he'd left behind, the flying, the missions, the call sign that still occasionally echoed through military channels when situations grew desperate. Thought about it for a long moment. Then he said was a name for a different person, someone who'd been necessary at the time but who no longer existed. The man sitting beside her was just a father, a consultant, someone who tried to do the right thing when the right thing was clear and who forgave himself when it wasn't. The call sign had been a tool. Tools were meant to be set down when the work was done. His work now was different. His work now was watching his daughter play in the sunshine and being present for a life that was finally, completely his.